It started with a single Vespa, abandoned in the middle of an empty lot. Pinewood Lakes was an upscale neighborhood, the kind where every lawn was perfectly trimmed, every mailbox matched, and the HOA ruled with an iron fist. You couldn't paint your door without getting approval. You couldn't leave your garbage bins out a minute too late. The HOA patrolled the streets like watchdogs, ensuring absolute uniformity. So when a blue Vespa scooter appeared in the field near the community clubhouse, people were confused. At first they assumed it was just a mistake. Maybe some teenager had left it there. But days passed, and the Vespa didn't move. Then the HOA got involved. Mr. Thompson, the HOA president, was a man who took his job way too seriously. He treated every minor infraction like a federal crime. The moment he spotted the Vespa, he stormed into action. "Who left this eyesore here?" he barked at the HOA board during their emergency meeting. "It's lowering property values. We need it gone, immediately." Flyers were printed, emails were sent, notices were taped to every community mailbox. The message was clear. Vespa owners, remove your scooter immediately. Violators will be fined. But no one came forward, and the Vespa stayed exactly where it was. The Vespa wasn't just an abandoned scooter anymore. It was an obsession. Mr. Thompson, the ever-vigilant HOA president, was losing sleep over it. Every morning before his coffee, he checked on the Vespa. Every night, before turning off his porch light, he checked again. And each time, it sat there in the field, untouched, unmoved, like some kind of silent rebellion against his authority. "This is unacceptable," he raged in the next HOA meeting. "We have rules." The HOA launched a full-scale investigation. Security camera footage from nearby houses was reviewed. Emails were sent to all homeowners demanding answers. A few particularly enthusiastic HOA members even went door to door, questioning residents. But no one knew where the Vespa came from. Then came the theories. Some residents believed the Vespa belonged to a reckless teenager who left it there after sneaking into the neighborhood. Others whispered that it was some kind of prank, maybe even a challenge against the HOA's authority. A few neighbors joked that it was planted by a rival HOA from the next community over, Meadowbrook Estates, Pinewood Lakes' longtime competitor in the best neighborhood rankings. But then, things got strange. The HOA's plan backfires. Frustrated, Mr. Thompson decided to take matters into his own hands. One night at exactly 2 a.m., he and a couple of HOA board members drove out to the field. The plan? Take the Vespa and impound it. They arrived quietly, wearing dark clothes, like some kind of HOA secret agents. With flashlights in hand, they marched through the field toward the Vespa. The air was cold. A light fog hovered over the grass. Then, just as Mr. Thompson reached for the Vespa's handlebars, the streetlights flickered, the wind picked up, and then the Vespa's engine suddenly roared to life. Mr. Thompson jumped back, eyes wide. The other HOA members stumbled away in shock, and then, before their very eyes, the Vespa moved. Not rolled, not tipped over. It drove off, on its own. Through the fog, the Vespa sped away, headlights glowing like some kind of phantom vehicle. The HOA board members stood frozen, their flashlights shaking in their hands. Then, silence. The Vespa was gone. A town gripped by fear. By sunrise, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. Someone had seen Mr. Thompson running home in the middle of the night, his face pale, his tie loosened, and his perfectly combed hair disheveled. That alone was a shocking sight. Mr. Thompson never looked anything less than perfectly pressed and painfully uptight. Then the whispers started. The Vespa. It moved on its own. Did you hear? The HOA tried to take it and it just vanished. Somebody said it chased them. It's haunted, I'm telling you, it's haunted. At first, people laughed it off. A haunted Vespa? Come on. It was probably just some teenager messing with them. Maybe the scooter had been remotely controlled. Maybe it belonged to some tech geek testing self-driving technology. But then, more things started happening. The strange sightings begin. The Vespa had disappeared that night, but the next morning it was back in the same exact spot, perfectly parked, as if it had never moved. Now the panic really started setting in. People began driving out of their way to avoid the field. Joggers who usually ran past it suddenly changed their routes. Parents told their kids not to go near it. Even the neighborhood dogs, normally eager to sniff anything new, refused to go near the Vespa, whining and pulling on their leashes. And then there was old Mrs. Carmichael. Mrs. Carmichael had lived in Pinewood Lakes for 25 years. She was in her 70s, walked her tiny chihuahua every morning at 6 a.m., and didn't believe in nonsense. She had seen everything in this neighborhood: HOA, feuds, garden gnome wars, mailbox color disputes, but she had never seen anything like this. One morning she marched right up to the Vespa with her tiny dog, Peppa, in tow. Enough of this foolishness, she huffed, raising her cane. She tapped the Vespa with it. Nothing happened. She tapped it again. The headlight flickered. Then, a mechanical whine filled the air. The Vespa's handlebars twitched. The wheels spun slightly and the engine made a sound like a low mechanical growl. Mrs. Carmichael backed away immediately. She didn't say a word, just turned around and marched straight back home, without another glance. The next morning she had a for sale sign in her yard. The HOA calls for an emergency meeting. By the third day, the HOA had completely lost control. They couldn't explain the Vespa, they couldn't remove it, and worst of all, people were starting to defy them. For years, the HOA had ruled with an iron fist, but now the neighborhood was laughing at them. The great Mr. Thompson couldn't get rid of a scooter. Hey, HOA, why don't you find the Vespa for existing? Maybe it'll leave on its own. What's next? A ghost committee? Mr. Thompson was furious, so he did what any HOA president would do. He called an emergency town meeting. That night, every homeowner gathered in the Pinewood Lakes Community Clubhouse. The tension was thick. The HOA board sat at a long table looking stressed and exhausted. Mr. Thompson stood at the front, adjusting his tie, gripping the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, clearing his throat, "we have a problem." The crowd erupted. "We know," someone shouted. "You think? Fix it." Mr. Thompson raised his hands. "We don't know who put that thing there," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We don't know how it moves. But I assure you, the HOA is taking every measure to remove it." Silence. Then, from the back of the room, a voice rang out. "What if it doesn't want to be removed?" The room fell dead silent. Everyone turned toward the speaker, an old man sitting near the back, arms crossed, face grim. His name was Mr. Holloway. He was one of the oldest residents in Pinewood Lakes. He had lived there longer than even Mrs. Carmichael. He barely ever came to HOA meetings, but now he looked worried. Mr. Thompson frowned. "Sir, I assure you this is just a matter of finding the owner and—" "No." Mr. Holloway shook his head. "That Vespa doesn't belong to anyone here. It doesn't belong to anyone alive. A story from the past." The room fell into silence. Mr. Holloway's words hung in the air like a thick fog. Every eye in the Pinewood Lakes Community Clubhouse was locked onto the old man. Even Mr. Thompson, The ever-confident, ever-commanding HOA president looked shaken. "What do you mean? It doesn't belong to anyone alive?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Mr. Holloway sighed. He leaned forward, resting his old hands on the table. His voice was low, heavy, and serious. "That field, it wasn't always empty." A cold chill ran through the room. People exchanged nervous glances. They had all moved into Pinewood Lakes believing it was a pristine, planned community, carefully designed for upper-class suburban life. But something in Mr. Holloway's voice told them there was something they didn't know. The legend of the Lone Rider. 40 years ago, Mr. Holloway began, before this neighborhood existed, before the HOA was even a thought. This place was nothing but dirt roads and open land, and there was a man who used to ride through here every night on a Vespa. A few people chuckled nervously. It sounded ridiculous, a man on a Vespa being the source of all this chaos. But Mr. Holloway's face was dead serious. He was a drifter. No one knew his real name. He never stayed in one place for long. But he had one rule. Wherever he went, he never let anyone take his Vespa. Mr. Holloway glanced toward the window where the field was barely visible under the glow of the street lights. One night, he was riding down that road. It was late, past midnight. The old town sheriff said he was going too fast, trying to beat a storm rolling in. Witnesses say he hit a patch of gravel, lost control, and went flying right into that field. A hush fell over the room. They found his body the next morning, but his Vespa, gone. People shifted in their seats. Some say the storm washed it away. Mr. Holloway continued. Some say someone stole it. But others... He paused, his voice dropping even lower. Others say it never left that field. The HOA's final attempt. Mr. Thompson rubbed his temples. He was trying to keep control of the situation. He wasn't the kind of man to believe in ghost stories. "Okay," he said, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "That's a very interesting tale, Mr. Holloway, but the HOA has procedures for these things. We'll have it towed in the morning." Mr. Holloway shook his head. "You can't." Mr. Thompson rolled his eyes. "Why not?" Mr. Holloway locked eyes with him, because every time someone tries to move it, something happens. The tension hit its peak. Some people gathered their things, ready to get out of there. Others sat frozen, eyes darting between Mr. Holloway and the HOA board. "I'm not saying you have to believe me," Mr. Holloway said, his voice grave. "But if you try to remove it, you might not like what happens next." The final night. Mr. Thompson wasn't backing down. The next morning he called in a tow truck. The driver, a big guy named Carl, showed up in his bright orange truck and backed it up toward the Vespa. A small crowd gathered, residents watching from their porches, whispering nervously. Carl hopped out, gave the Vespa a weird look, then said, "This is it? This is what y'all are scared of?" He laughed, pulled out some chains, and started hooking them to the Vespa's frame. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as Carl tightened the chains, every car alarm in the neighborhood went off, all at once. Horn blasts, headlights flashing, the sounds of sirens screaming through the streets. Carl jumped back, cursing. The crowd gasped. Then the Vespa moved. Not much, just an inch, but enough for everyone to see it. Carl stumbled back. His tough guy attitude was gone. "Forget this," he muttered. He unhooked the chains, jumped into his truck, and peeled out of there, tires screeching. That night nobody slept, nobody went outside, and in the morning the Vespa was gone. The aftermath. The HOA never spoke about it again. the field was paved over and turned into a community garden. Mr. Thompson stopped holding emergency meetings. He even resigned a few months later, claiming he wanted to spend more time with family. The Vespa was never seen again, but sometimes, on foggy nights, residents swear they hear the faint sound of an engine revving somewhere in the distance, and those who walk near the field late at night say the air still feels a little colder.